Welcome to Taking the Edge Off the Middle East, a series of casual conversations that offer up rare insider knowledge on the most important events in the broader Middle East and why it matters to America today. I'm Brian Katulis. I'm the host of the program. I'm a senior fellow here at the Middle East Institute. And today, I'm joined by my good friend, Richard Fontaine, CEO of the Center for a New American Security. Richard, welcome to MEI. Let's take some edge off the Middle East.
Let's do it. Thank you for having me.
Good to see you, my friend. We're going to talk about all the places we traveled together, all the fun we've had, your recent report on swing states. We're recording this in mid-October. This podcast episode will come out in mid-November. We have a backup of great episodes that I hope people have already listened to, with Marvin Weinbaum on Afghanistan and Pakistan, with Mara Rudman on what's going on Israel-Palestinian affairs. But I'm really lucky, feel lucky to have you here, not only to talk about your report, which talks about swing states, but to talk about what's going on in U.S. foreign policy these days. And again, we'll have a gap of about 2-3 weeks before this episode comes out. But I think we have a pretty good laydown from President Trump and his team on where they're going in the world. And I want to note, not only are you the head of a prominent think tank, we'll talk more about your background. You work closely with Senator John McCain, and you come from a part of the Republican Party that maybe is not as represented in this current administration. Would you agree or disagree with that?
I think that's probably a fair summation of the situation.
Yeah. But let's start where we are now, and then we'll hit the rewind button.
Yeah.
How do you see Trump 2.0 on foreign policy overall? What's different, not only compared to the predecessor administration, Biden, but how is he different from his first term on how he approaches the world overall?
Well, I think in terms of his difference between now and his first term, the people that he is surrounded by are very different. I mean, he didn't seem to know a lot of foreign policy types in the first administration. He got kind of traditionalist Republicans and generals to staff most of the big jobs.
Yeah.
They seem to have quite different ideas than he did about the conduct of foreign policy.
Yeah.
Try to insulate him, push him in this direction or that. You see very little of that in this term. He's much more decisive about his own ideas, but his own ideas are not always that stable. And so you see lots of lurching, lots of contradictions in our policies, and a focus on the things that Trump has been very transparent he cares about the most: commercial deals, trade, and foreigners sort of taking advantage of the United States, whether they're allies or trade partners or immigrants or whatever, that he's going to sort of put right. And then other niche things that are important to him, sometimes because of his personal relationships with leaders.
But we're just 10 months in. I know it's a little too soon to tell, but do you think the moves that he's made, the plays that he's ran, have improved America's strategic position in the world in any way, or has it diminished it, or is it just sort of a wash?
I don't think it's improved the strategic position. I think there are good points and there are successes, and we can talk about that. But if you try to net it out, the combination of the kind of lurching and unpredictability, plus, which I think is a very significant change from previous administrations, including his own, this dramatic international economic policy to tariff the entire world and at least be perceived as harming the economies of all of our friends and allies, in addition to all of our adversaries. And then the destruction of some of our soft power foreign policy tools, whether it's democracy promotion institutions, our USAID and foreign aid, international broadcasting, all these other kinds of, you put all of this together, and I think we have fewer tools to accomplish things in the world, and we have a narrower definition of national interest.
Yeah, so those are a lot of the negatives. You mentioned some positives. What are some of the positives for a balanced ledger?
Well, I mean, going back to the sort of style of foreign policy making, there is something to be said for decisiveness. Trump is decisive for sure.
Right.
And that has led to outcomes, some good, some bad. But I think that it's probable that only Donald Trump could have gotten Hamas and Israel on board with this peace plan when he did. And or you look at the war, the 12-day war with between Israel and Iran. And I think the world is better off without 3 Iranian nuclear sites. Had this been another president, there would have been probably months of analysis and meetings and, other things like that, and probably no decision at the end of the day.
Yeah.
On the diplomacy on Gaza, there would have been, lots of shuttling and lots of meetings and lots of, well, the Israelis won't take this, but we're making progress here.
Yeah.
And basically saying you have to do this seemed to work in that case.
Yeah, and I think he also used this confluence of circumstances after Israel struck Hamas leaders who were in Doha, Qatar, on September 9th.
That's
and I actually think the fact that he, by all accounts, was accessible on the phone, was texting, had this connectivity with leaders in the region, and also was, it seems from the polls in Israel, more popular than the Prime Minister Netanyahu. And he leveraged that in a way that I thought was actually quite dexterous, which is not a term that I would use with this foreign policy. But that 2-3 week period after the September 9th strikes, basically the month after that, from that to when he went to Israel and then Egypt on this flash trip, I just did the math on this trip he did this week. He spent more time in the air, double the amount of time in the air than he did on the ground. And most of the time on the ground was actually the public appearances and the speeches and strategic communications and photo ops, which is, I think, a testimony to his, and it's not a dig on him. It's actually, he understands that presidential leadership actually still matters and people listen to America. But the question is, will he follow up with sort of the good that he's done in getting the ceasefire and hostage release and follow through with his 20 points?
Yeah, exactly. Follow through is not been the strong suit of multiple administrations, and certainly not this one.
Yeah.
So, we will know more by the time this podcast comes out as to exactly where things stand. But you talked about the materials he had to work with, which were, it wasn't all force of personality and style and all these other kinds of things. He had, as you said, the Israeli attack on Doha that helped him have leverage. He also had almost everyone who's relevant saying that Hamas can no longer be running Gaza.
Yeah.
So, he had the GCC said that, the Arab League said that, Pakistan said that, Indonesia said that, obviously Israel said that. Everybody was saying that. And that wasn't the case 9 or 10 or months ago or a year ago. So he had more to work with there. And then also, leaning on the Turks and the Egyptians and the Qataris to try to convince Hamas that holding the hostages was becoming a liability rather than a leverage.
Yeah.
So you put those things together, but nevertheless, somebody had to put them together. And I think he does get credit for that.
Great. So we covered the Middle East. We covered the world quickly. I want to get to your report that you did. It came out in June of this year. Swing states, global swing states, and the new great power competition. You authored it with your colleague Gibbs McKinley. And you actually brought me into some of the earlier sort of peer review process and things like this. What I really liked about it, and I know you had done work on this before, and this is sort of an update of some of that thinking. But it's a pretty simple thing. We foreign policy people actually don't know how to put things into terms that other people outside of our club really can talk about. And I liked the swing state phrase because we use it here in America to talk about states like Pennsylvania and those that are sort of purple. They're not Republican or Democrat. And if you win that swing state, it can get you the presidency. And it gets us, I don't know if that's what's the genesis of the term? How did you come up with it? And what does it mean? To put it in simple terms is what what I thought you did in the report.
Well, so swing states comes from the domestic political context.
Yeah.
A state that could, whose sort of ultimate disposition and ultimate alignment, ultimate political identity could go either way or is sort of manifold in potential outcomes, right? And so I see you have kind of a Western bloc of G7 and the NATO allies and Japan and Australia and the Asian allies and all of this. And you've got, what I've called with my colleague Andrea Kendall-Taylor this axis of upheaval. So you go to China, Iran, and North Korea and Russia that are working together more closely. And then you have lots of countries that are not in either block, if you can call them blocks. They're probably not as much blocks as they were during the Cold War, but they're pretty identifiable groups of countries, right? And so there are a lot of countries that have multi-alignment. They're not non-aligned because they have relationships with the big powers and everything else, and they want to continue that. So within that group of many countries that has sort of multi-alignment, there's some that are more consequential than others. We identified Brazil, India, Indonesia, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, South Africa, those 6. Now, why those 6? Well, each one is a regional heavyweight. Each one makes decisions and takes actions that have some kind of global import, some global influence. And then collectively, they have the possibility of adding weight to outcomes and we talked about this thing that people call the global order. Now, talk about something else that foreign policy types talk about all the time, and no one seems to really understand what they mean. We actually tried to define what is this thing, this global order, the liberal order, the rules-based international order, all of that stuff.
Yeah, I gotta say something about this. When I was at my previous think tank where I worked, we did polling and focus groups out of the bubble in 2019. And before we did the polling, we listened to people in Georgia, in Michigan, and we threw out phrases that we foreign policy types use. Liberal international order. People are either confused or chuckled because they saw nothing, like they think liberal and but the other one was American exceptionalism. And I remember one woman in a focus group saying, "Yeah, I think America is exceptional. We accept a lot of nonsense in this country."
Exceptionalism.
No, but it's I'm not laughing at her. I'm laughing at us.
Yeah.
That we also
totally.
Yeah, we don't use a language that people speak, and Trump does. President Trump actually speaks in a way, and he does it on these trips, just like he did in the Middle East when he was visiting in early October of this year. He actually, in some ways, it's too much like a campaign rally because he's digging on his ex-competitor in the campaigns and things like this. But it's a language that ordinary people can speak.
Yeah, so that is true. But I also think it goes beyond that. I don't think that we often really have a common understanding of what we're talking about when we talk to each other. I mean, so look at this, right? Like the first Trump administration and then the Biden administration both issued national security strategies that said China wants to alter the existing international order in accordance with its own authoritarian preferences.
Yeah.
We don't want that. And we better figure out what does that mean? What is this order that they want to? And so that led to a lot of people in our biz. Some people say, well, there actually is no such thing as the international order. It's all just fantasy. Other people said, no, there is one, but we don't like it either. Yeah, as Americans, we've been screwed by it because that means trade. And there's other people who said, well, there used to be one, but now it's just been so frayed that who cares? And all this other stuff. Anyway, so we looked at this and tried to define it very precisely. Like, what is this thing? And it's some principles, right? It's a principle that countries can't change borders by force and take someone else's territory. It's the principle of freedom on the high seas.
Yeah.
It's the principle of basic human rights. It's the principle of an open international trading system. It's the principle of an open international financial system. And those principles are kind of instantiated in different institutions and rules and all that stuff. And those things can change. But the question ultimately is, would you rather live in a world where those principles are there or not? Right?
Yeah.
So Russia wants to live in a world where if a big country decides it would like to take the territory of another country, it can do it if it has a big enough military, kills enough people.
Yeah.
I think we don't want to live in a world like that, right? And you can sort of China wants to live in a world where if you say, oh, well, this entire international waterway is actually ours, then that's it instead of freedom of the seas. So I don't think we want to live in that.
Well, what would you say about Trump and the second term? And here we are 9-10 months into it, and the strikes against purported Venezuelan drug gangs.
Right. So this is, as we were going through this this work and writing this up and frankly doing these visits to each of the countries and talking to folks there, many people stopped and said, isn't America the global swing state?
So
you guys seem to be swinging all over the place. And if you're talking about international order, you guys can't tell whether you like it, you hate it, or you want to completely change it. And there is a lot to that. I would distinguish, though. I think the Trump administration, such as it is kind of conceptualized, has a skepticism about some of the key parts of international order. I think the countries like Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea have more of a rejection of the international.
Well, they're actively trying to. So I've used the
frame. They want to replace it with something else in many cases.
But do they have an idea of what it is? Because a lot of those countries are quite different. And I've used the phrase or the idea that they're like termites trying to chip away at the order. And I don't mean that like the countries operate in that way. And how they're trying to reduce the structures that benefited America and open liberal democracies, and they're chipping away at it. But I don't think like the Soviet Union, many of these countries have a clear, coherent ideology that they're trying to actually translate globally around the world. Do you agree? Or
not a revolutionary ideology, not a global, we need to have global revolution and, history is going to bring us into this new era where human affairs are structured very differently, but all four want a sphere of influence that they don't currently possess, right? Russia wants it in its near abroad. China wants its so-called core interests, including Taiwan and the South China Sea. North Korea wants the entire Korean peninsula. Iran, wants a dominant role in the kind of Middle East. They can't have that. They'd like to have it. They see the United States as an impediment to having those things, right?
Yeah.
We don't want them to have those things, I think. You can look at this economically. You sort of go function by function. And so, no, I don't think that Russia cares much about whether Brazil has a sphere of influence in South America all to its own. They're not going to get out of bed for that.
Yeah.
But there's enough commonality among these countries from their own perspectives to have essentially a common sense of what they want to see big picture and who is the biggest impediment to achieve.
Yeah, but stick with me on this termites thing for a second, because the reason why I actually think the foreign interference in open democracies, including in ours, and trying to chip away at that sense of common purpose and what I think is essential, and we'll talk a little bit about the vital center and rebuilding it, feeding off of these divisions on the far right and the far left, and actually encouraging, our intel agencies, when they were doing these things last year, reporting publicly about Iran interfering directly in some of the campus protests about the Gaza war, or Russia and China famously doing that. So I don't mean that the people are alike, but they serve as like trying to chip away at sort of the things that actually keep open societies together. And that's all.
No, but actually I totally agree with you. And I think that we, because of the controversy around Russia's interference in the 2016 election, it's almost like, we don't want to look at foreign interference in our own democracy as hard as we should. And that is a manifest threat. And obviously, as Americans, we give adversary countries lots of kindling to work with if you want to start fires, political fires in the United States, right?
Yeah.
And then, of course, you have all the technological tools to be able to do it and everything else. But, ultimately, America, if you step way back and look at this kind of big competition that I think the United States is in globally, the United States has everything necessary to prevail. We've got the geography, the economy, the military, the technology, the alliances, the values. The question is whether we have the cohesion and the decisiveness to put it all together in the right way. And of course, that's going to be one of the areas where potential or real adversaries try to chip away.
So before we get into the case I want to ask you about, which is Saudi Arabia, the swing state, just two questions on the bigger picture. And sorry for introducing an academic highfalutin term that we use, but you paint a picture of the world. Would you say that you believe we're in a phase of complex multipolarity, meaning that there's not one singular power in the world that dominates things? Or how do you see the world? Because if you're using this paradigm of swing states, and they basically can gravitate either to China's orbit or Russia or things like this, it's certainly not bipolar. It's not Russia versus Soviet Union versus the United States. Or is it G0 as Ian Bremmer or others people? How do you describe the world, the structure of the world?
Yeah, I think there's three great powers in the U.S., China, and Russia, with the U.S. and China being significantly ahead of Russia in terms of power and sort of pull economically and politically. But Russia nevertheless has strengths that are pretty obvious. And then you have a series of kind of middle power countries. Some of these are just the global swing states that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
And then you have kind of the rest of the world. But it's not just it's not sort of every country sort of floating as a free radical out there, right? Because again, you do have at least the outlines of a coherent Western bloc. Now, we could maybe do our best to dilute that, but you still have it, right?
Right.
And you have the outlines at least of an axis that includes, four revisionist powers, and probably on some days, other places like Belarus and Venezuela and Cuba and, things like that. And none of those, I don't think, would in either category would describe themselves as non-aligned or even multi-aligned, but then you have everybody else who would. So yes, multipolarity, but not every pole is identical to the other.
That's great. So second question on this notion of the BRICS nation and expanded BRICS. When I heard expanded BRICS, it felt like bricks without mortar, nothing that's getting them to stick together because it fits within the structure that we're going to talk about.
Right.
Do you think that, and most of these swing states are part of the BRICS? Is that correct or no?
Well, yeah. So Brazil and we'll go through them. BRICS. So okay, you could take Russia and China out of there, and then you go to the ones that don't have initials. But yes.
And did you make much of what Xi did at the end of August, early September, when he brought all these countries in advance of UNGA? And how do you think Xi and China's positioning itself in this global order?
Yeah, I did make a lot of that at two levels. One was I thought it was a pretty visceral manifestation of this axis of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. I mean, their leaders were all there, and three of them seemed to spend a lot of time walking together, holding hands and talking about, organ replacement and things like that. But
was Peter Thiel there?
Forget the days. I mean, we used to think North Korea was the most diplomatically isolated country in the world, and Russia, of course, after the invasion, those days are gone, right?
Yeah.
So they're able to come together. So I thought that was consequential, and the fact that they did it was emblematic of the existence of this axis. The other thing was the countries that are not part of that axis that were there anyway. I mean, this was Modi's trip to China for the first time in 7 years when he went to Tianjin for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And of course, then he's holding hands with Putin and with Xi Jinping. Putin, okay, maybe given the India-Russia relationship, but Xi Jinping, that's new. So why is that new? Well, I think that has to do in part with the character of the U.S.-India relationship right now. So it was the signal that we, I think, should have taken from not the countries that are already aligned kind of with China and Russia.
Yeah.
Or with China anyway, but rather the ones that we thought were getting closer to us, that were there, that I thought should have been a wake-up call.
So some are swing states or potential swing states and things like this. Look, we could nerd out on so many different countries, and we need to delve down into Italy.
We have no nerds who listen to this podcast. This is all
that's it.
Super cool.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
like us.
Yeah. And you do terrific work on India. I saw a piece you did recently with Lisa Curtis and your concerns about where the U.S.-India relationship is going. But we're at the Middle East Institute. Let's focus on the Middle East. Best to my knowledge, this podcast is coming out November 16th. I was at a dinner last night. We're recording this in mid-October. I heard that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who's a controversial figure in America's policy and political debates, is coming to visit with President Trump. You identify Saudi Arabia as one of the key swing states. What's your sort of view about the U.S.-Saudi relations today? And then apply your template and your formula and recommendations for how to work with swing states.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about how this visit you think should go and what should be done.
Yeah, so overall, I think it's worth thinking about, well, why is Saudi Arabia a global swing state in my kind of categorization here? I mean, what makes it different from, I don't know, other Gulf Arab countries or anybody else you might throw into that basket? And I think you can see from Saudi Arabia that it is, I mean, MBS talks about being explicitly multi-aligned, and has relationships with China and Russia and with the United States and with lots of other countries. It has sizable economy and is a military sort of power regionally. It is. And its decisions have sort of global importance, whether that's in energy markets or regional normalization that people outside of the region care about, or sort of what have you. I think in terms of the U.S.-Saudi relationship, to say that it's come a long way in the past decade or so, I think would probably be putting it mildly. I mean, there was so much attention, I think rightly so, for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and then the sort of fallout from that. During that period of U.S.-Saudi relations, the thing that kind of bothered me more than anything else, at least including that killing, was the recklessness of Saudi foreign policy.
Yeah.
I mean, you had, the recklessness and the lack of success, right? So
Yemen war.
But look, why did the Yemen war start? Well, it was really to reduce Iranian influence and Iranian proxy influence in Yemen. 2 years into that war, Iranian influence was greater than when they started. Kidnapping the prime minister of Lebanon and forcing him to resign only to see him back in power within a few days.
Yep.
Again, aimed to reduce Iranian power and Hezbollah power in Lebanon, which turned out to be greater after that episode rather than less. The consideration of invading Qatar and then boiling it down to an embargo. Again, we're going to reduce Qatari ties with Iran. Well, by embargoing them, they increased their economic ties.
Right.
Because, what would you expect? And so these were reckless, sort of sudden moves that I think militated against Saudi objectives and certainly against a lot of the interests of the United States.
Yeah.
That seems to have been a phase. You tell me what you think about this, but it seems to have evolved toward a more responsible foreign policy, and maybe there's been some learning in all this.
I think some of this is maturation. Look, I first met Mohammed bin Salman, I think, in 2015, and they had big ideas that are still relevant to their paradigm for today. And I think their center of gravity is mostly first and foremost at home. Yeah. This societal transformation, which you and I were there in 2023 as part of a dialogue. And they made a number of unforced errors so clearly, and I think they know it. It's hard in their system to recognize it, that went against what they were trying to do to transform their economy from an oil-based dependent economy to something where it's getting closer to in terms of investments in tech, in the next generation, and things like this. And it really it did two things. One, I think their unforced errors on the regional issues, I think demonstrated their own insecurity about their own position and power in the region and what Iran and others were doing. But then second, it produced, I agree with you, a learning moment where they actually became more pragmatic and tried to understand how they can be more of a force for stability in the region and learn from their mistakes. And then also do the things that they initially said they wanted to do, which was transform their economy and society, which is quite stunning when you look at it. It's still an absolute monarchy, to be clear. And one of the points in your report is that U.S. officials on Saudi Arabia should bring up these issues of human rights because it's part and parcel of who we are. And those are uncomfortable conversations. I'm almost certain the Trump administration is not going to have that conversation. But I agree with your approach, which is you got to deal with them pragmatically, but don't forget who we are because it's a reflection of some of the sentiments that I think are in Saudi society as well. Sorry, end of soapbox. But
but the notion that there's been some maturation of the foreign policy approach. Yeah. And then, it is really incredible to see societal transformation of that country. Yeah. Now, MBS has seemed to me to be very much a modernizer, to some extent a liberalizer, not at all a democratizer. Yeah. Okay. So the democracy and the sort of, some of the basic human rights side are going to be extremely wanting. And again, like you said, I think we should raise those issues and all of that. But the rest of this gives you something to work with, right? A more responsible foreign policy, a regional heavyweight being a global swing state, and sort of understanding who we might work with. That, to me, is cause for the United States to think deeply about what kind of relationship it has with Saudi Arabia over the long run. And, I think there's some things you can exclude right off the bat. I think the idea of, treating Saudi Arabia as a pariah kind of indefinitely, that didn't last very long for kind of obvious pragmatic reasons.
Under Biden, you're saying?
Under Biden. Yeah. I also think that, sort of trying to more or less boil much of this down to commercial deals and how much they'll invest here or there, or you're seeing Saudi Arabia largely kind of as a piggy bank is way too limited as well. Yeah. Which, is probably somewhat unfair of the Trump administration's approach, but I don't know that that's wildly off the mark in some cases. Yeah. And so what is a multifaceted relationship with Saudi Arabia looks like that has, the objective of improving the situation in the region and then anything beyond that in terms of global stuff? I think there's a lot that can be done.
Yeah. My view on this, and it's been this for a while, it was an unpopular one under the center-left circles, like in the 2015 to 2020 period, which is that Saudi Arabia is going to make some mistakes here. But what they're doing with their own transformation of at least their economy, if not political economy, the politics aren't changing, creates an opportunity for the U.S. to diversify its bilateral relationship with Saudi Arabia away from just simply arms sales and energy and things like this, and in many different sectors. And that's what I took away from your report, not only on the Saudi case, but other places, is that you've got to use the full spectrum of American power to actually draw more of these countries closer into your orbits. And it it's baffling to me why it took many in the Biden administration a couple of years to actually get to this point, back to the summer of 2023, where I think they oversold the case at the time for Israel-Saudi normalization that I think is inevitable and will happen. But they moved first too slowly and then too quickly to try to get things through, like a civilian nuclear deal and all of these.
And a security guarantee that would be enshrined in a treaty that would pass 2/3 of the U.S. Senate, and we would have a mutual defense agreement with Saudi Arabia.
There was no way pre-October 7th, my view, and it's not a popular view, but there was no way that was going to happen because of the politics of the moment.
I don't think so either.
And then, look, you're a Republican, I'm a Democrat. I thought when I asked people, Saudis, others, who's the point person the White House, the Biden team is using at the time to run these agreements through? And they said, Lindsey Graham. And I said, you're done. This is not going to work. It's also by 2024, it's an election year, the Gaza war and other things. It sounded a little, you'll get this is nerdy. It sounded a little like TPP to me, meaning Trans-Pacific Partnership. You send out smart negotiators who are earnest, who craft these deals, but then you have no political plan to run this through America's political system, right? I don't know.
Well, you also had the merits or demerits of the case, right? So to have a closer relationship with Saudi Arabia, I think in the year that they were trying to push the potential mutual security agreement idea made sense to a lot of people, actually. Yeah. But it still wasn't long after that era we were just talking about of recklessness, right? So anyone who really thought about it had to say, okay, what if Saudi Arabia decides to do a Yemen-like war or a Lebanon-like kidnapping or a Qatar-like embargo or invasion? We're on the hook to defend them?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
that's what we're signing up for? The more time goes on that you see a more responsible foreign policy, then maybe the calculation becomes different. But it wasn't that long then. I didn't think that it was likely to get through the Congress, and of course it became a moot point after the Hamas attack.
So that's recent history. Let's take it to now. And MBS is coming here. And again, we have a bit of a lag time between recording and when this comes out. What's the one thing you wish President Trump would do differently on Saudi Arabia to adopt the principles of your swing states report, given that Saudi is such an important swing state?
I do think there's a regional agenda, which is not totally, kind of flows from this global swing states notion. But I think regional normalization would be a good thing. I think, everybody seems to understand this. And I think the Trump administration does as well. I would like to see regional normalization without requiring a U.S. security guarantee for Saudi Arabia. I do worry that when the president did what he did the other day, issue an executive order and say that we will defend Qatar indefinitely. And,
right.
If there's a similar kind of thing on Saudi Arabia, that is not a prudent exercise.
Because it doesn't have it's a weak foundation. It doesn't have buy-in from our
one if it's an executive sort of thing, which is what the EO was on Qatar, and the only thing I think that could be done on Saudi Arabia, that it could be repealed. And the whole nature of these kind of relationships is that they're in place for a long time, right?
Yeah.
Because they have credibility and deterrent power and things like that. The other is we don't have that kind of relationship with Israel. We don't have a security guarantee for Israel. We don't have it for Taiwan. We don't have it for Singapore. There's a lot of countries we are close to, and we don't have it for India. Are these the two countries in the world that we would want to be responsible for defending into the indefinite future? That, I think, is not an obvious yes for sure. And I think that's why you have searching debate if you go do something like have a treaty and get enough people in the political leadership to agree they want to do that, rather than just, somebody's coming to town and, this would be nice and this is what they really want. But I think maybe they can get regional normalization with, enough sort of incentives on the American side that sort of exclude that. But, in terms of the sort of global swing states aspect of this, I think Saudi Arabia is becoming increasingly important on technology. Technologies, obviously, especially on AI and digital infrastructure, increasingly contested and increasingly part of the currency of international relations.
Yeah.
They have both their own infrastructure, their own ambitions, and the capital to fund different things. I mean, they work with Huawei, they work with the United States. I think establishing a bilateral tech framework where we could harmonize our efforts on technology globally would be good. It would be great to have economic agreements in place so that you have ensured access to capital markets and on the economic side and things like that beyond the commercial deals and stuff like that. To the extent to which Saudi Arabia is expressing preferences or positions on some of the other kind of global order related things we care about, like the Russian invasion of Ukraine or like, freedom of the seas and things like that, the closer they are to the positions I think we wish to see obtain, the better it would be. So those are the kinds of things. And it tends not, frankly, to be the kind of things that we think about that much with Saudi Arabia. We say, oh, are they going to increase oil?
Yeah, exactly.
Or are they going to decrease oil?
Yeah.
What's their CT effort look like last month?
What you and Gibbs are arguing in your report is actually having a multidimensional approach to these key swing states like Saudi Arabia, like on different vectors, but not just bilaterally, but how they operate internationally.
Exactly. So treat them as a global actor.
Yeah. Yeah.
And if you're going to treat them as a global actor, then you look at what they do or could do globally, right? And that goes well beyond some of the traditional issues. Okay, energy. We've talked to Saudi Arabia about energy forever.
Right.
CT. Okay, got it. Regional normalization, good, but that's been in the hopper for a long time too. What about all this other stuff?
Yeah.
And that, I think, is the opportunity.
So you heard it here first. Richard Fontaine thinks we need more discussions with Saudis and broader discussions, and that's a good thing. Last question on this before we move to the rewind button and talk about your career and life. Do you think normalization is possible without a two-state solution? I've had Elliot Abrams on the program recently. We talked about how he and Rob Malley actually have the same position right now, which is not in favor of a two-state solution. Do you think it's a necessary condition for that normalization you argue for in your report? Like, and I see it as inevitable, but do you think a two-state solution is a key ingredient?
I don't think that the establishment of a Palestinian state is a necessary precondition for Saudi-Israel normalization. Mm-hmm. I think it's not for a couple of reasons. One, look at all the other countries that normalize with Israel in the absence of a Palestinian state.
Yeah.
Also look at some of the changing positions of the Saudis. I mean, after the Hamas attack, they kind of got onto this, there has to be a Palestinian state before we'll normalize. Before that, it was more like there have to be steps toward a Palestinian state. Well, the difference between having a Palestinian state and having steps toward a Palestinian state is gigantic.
Yeah.
Right? And so that suggests to me that as the war in Gaza, God willing, goes away, then they may revert to their previous position, which doesn't require the establishment of a state, but maybe some of the things that what could one day lead to that. And I think that is doable.
Yeah, I actually think it's more of a condition than many people talk about, and in part because of a 2-year war. But there's another dynamic that I see in discussions with Saudis and others is that a few years ago, their threat perception about Iran was one thing, and now it's still there, but they are on a different path than Israel is. They want to de-escalate tensions in the region. It's MBS today on Iran is not where he was in 2016 or 17. But here's the thing that I actually think is quite different as well, is that Saudis see themselves on this modernization track leaping into the 21st century on space and technology and things like this. And they actually, after this period of some of their own unforced errors, they look at Israel today, and especially after the Qatar attack and all these other things that they in some ways benefited from a security standpoint, but the unpredictability of it, but also the parts of Israel that are backward looking from their perspective, meaning the right wing and others who, as one Saudi said to me, these Israelis, they never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And it's interesting to me to hear Saudis saying we're moving forward, but there's elements inside of the Israeli society that want to move their country backwards. And that's going to prevent sort of a bigger picture block, whether or not it's a full-fledged state, but something that shows appreciation for the dignity of ordinary Palestinians. That price, I think, has gone much higher.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's one other aspect of this that may militate in the direction of what you're saying rather than what I was saying before, which is the Pakistani-Saudi Mutual Defense Agreement, which the Saudis say brings Saudi Arabia under the Pakistani nuclear umbrella. The Pakistanis have backed away from that. And so kind of who knows. But why'd they do that? Clearly it had been in the works for a while. And we normally would have looked at it and said, well, they want a nuclear umbrella because of Iran. But it was post-Doha hit by the Israelis, which both sides said, sort of catalyzed their discussions, made things a little bit quicker to move. So, maybe they are seeing this not just as, there's Iran out there and whatever we do with non-Iran countries is by definition going to be good for our security, but rather this is getting a little more complicated than it was before because, Iran is weaker and Israel does stuff like attack, our neighbors.
No, there you go. So let me hit the rewind button on your career and let's go back to the early 2000s. You were working for Senator John McCain. Tell us what John McCain was like.
He was an amazing person and complicated in so many ways. I mean, his personal story, which is the one thing that everybody knows about him, that he was in prison for 5.5 years after being shot down in Vietnam, and everything else is important and fascinating. And in my experience, probably in some ways the least interesting thing about him, and it certainly didn't define the rest of his life. He was a student of history, constantly reading history and applying historical lessons, a complete and utter believer in American exceptionalism. There you go. There's your term. There's another wonky term. But American exceptionalism, American leadership in the world, the exercise of American power, not only for national, sort of narrowly construed national interests, but for values, for moral ends. He's Wilsonian in that sense in a lot of ways. But he's also freaking hilarious. And so much fun to travel with.
Oh, I want to hear about
I spent 5.5 years of my life probably spending more time, other than my wife. He was probably the adult I spent the most time with. And he would see every foreign official who came to town. We were constantly traveling internationally. He would look for the craziest or most dangerous places in the world. And while other senators, wanted to go on a shopping trip to Rio, we would go to, wherever it just had a massacre or something like that, and all of that. So, and I guess the other thing about McCain, and maybe this does actually, the armchair psychology come from the fact that, he was in one place for 5.5 years. He always had to be moving, run to the sound of the guns. To the point where, like, sometimes I say, John, we can act and we can move. Let's figure out what direction first.
So he's sort of an adrenaline junkie and wants to be in the action and where it was at. So
do what's important.
So I talked to a bunch of our mutual friends before this interview, and who
now this is for all these listeners, this is news to me too. So oh god.
So I got a couple of questions based on some of these trips because these trips are interesting. So first, what's a CODEL? Tell us what a CODEL is.
Congressional delegation. A group of senators or House members, every now and then some mixture of senators and House members, but usually they travel in packs of one or the other. More often bipartisan than not. Which was back then, but even now sometimes.
A little bit, I
mean, which would probably surprise people. But you go off to some place, and usually there's somewhere between one staffer for everybody, which was McCain's sort of MO. I would be the one person who would get to go, and the other senators wouldn't bring anybody. Or more normal ones, everybody brings a staffer, and everybody's happy.
Nice.
But you go off to whatever the country in question is, and usually you get extraordinary meetings. I mean, you meet the head of state and the foreign minister and the defense minister and everything else.
And the point of this, it's not just boondoggles and shopping, but you're in Congress.
We never shop.
At least Senator McCain did.
Wait, we never. No, I mean, it became like a running joke. I mean, he used to say about me that I had gotten sick in more countries than most people will visit in a lifetime. I mean, and we would travel very fast. I mean, I remember doing 8 countries in 8 days. I remember leaving from Andrews Air Force Base and doing 5 countries on a Wednesday, doing 5 countries, one of which was Kyrgyzstan, not exactly around the corner, being back on Sunday.
Wow.
So, move very fast, try to see as many people as you can, but also try to get out of the packaged party line, whether that's going to be from the government or whatever it is, right? So if you go to Iraq, don't just go to Baghdad and talk to the people there and the generals and all this other stuff, but go to, even try to talk to, leaders and others outside of government and really try to get a sense for ground truth. And then, hopefully come back to Washington with an idea of what you can do that would be productive. Is there legislation you can do? Is there some policy that should be changed? Is there some program that should be different? Something like that. I mean, this is not just sort of academic idle navel gazing.
What's the weirdest place you've been on a CODEL? The strangest that stands out?
Socotra.
What was?
Socotra Island off the coast of Yemen.
Uh-huh.
So most of these trips would be oriented around a couple of key places. Usually it was Iraq and Afghanistan, or I don't know, some other place that we were going to go, some geopolitical importance. But then every now and then I would go I'd get called into McCain's office, and he had this old atlas, and he would have this old atlas on his lap. This was never a good sign.
Uh-huh.
And he would be looking, and he would say, we've got to fly over this area. We're going to have our own plane because we fly military air.
Yeah.
We can just stop for a few hours. So we went to Socotra Island for a few hours, which most people, and we went to Yemen to see President Saleh and McCain.
What year was this? Do you remember?
This was that was 2000 and probably 2006, 2007.
So what made this the strangest?
The fact that there's nothing on Socotra Island other than dragon's blood trees.
So what did you do?
Looked at the dragon's blood trees, got our plane blown all over the place. It landed in this airstrip, they called it airport.
Yeah.
And so we sort of looked around, and then and I remember Joe Lieberman was with us and said something to the effect of, "We're a real long way from home." And then we went over to Sana'a. And of course, because it was McCain, we had to do a walking tour of the old city.
Yeah.
And this is they had Al Qaeda crawling around, out in the hinterlands and stuff like that. He insisted that we eat dinner in a downtown restaurant, which the U.S. Embassy started jokingly referring to as the suicide mission.
Uh-huh.
So we did stuff like that. We also went to Bhutan. We went to Svalbard and Barrow, Alaska, in the Arctic Circle.
Yeah.
We went to Yukon Territory. We went to the South Pole. I mean, we went to some odd.
So what was it like? What was former Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi really like to meet in person?
Gaddafi, he seemed crazy, actually, to me.
Yeah.
So it was one of these classic things. We went into Tripoli. We were going to see Gaddafi. This is obviously pre-revolution there and all of this. And the U.S. had this kind of budding relationship with Libya. They had gotten rid of their
nuclear weapons.
Their weapons of mass destruction program, all this. And so, we did a few meetings, and then we were supposed to see Gaddafi. The meeting was supposed to be at 2 p.m. or something like that.
Uh-huh.
Well, the government did the tin pot dictator thing they do, which is 2 or so, right?
Yeah.
And so, okay, all right. So we walked a little bit around Old Town Tripoli. Okay,
yeah.
It took a few minutes, and then we're back in the hotel waiting. 2:00, 3:00. They gave us copies of the Green Book. Okay, got that. 4:00. And they said, no. When in a few minutes we're gonna leave. We're gonna leave.
Yeah.
And 5:00, 6:00, 7:00, 8:00. Nothing happening. Finally, 9 p.m. McCain looks, and they had these Libyan government kind of liaison officers there. We had a U.S. charge there, in the hotel. Again, everybody's just kind of waiting. And McCain says, "It's 9:00. We leave within the next hour for this meeting, or I go to sleep. And when I wake up, we get on the plane, and we leave this country, and we don't come back."
Yeah.
It was like detonating a small nuclear blast, and suddenly activity all over the place. Oh my God! All stuff. So suddenly these black sedans pick us up, driven by Libyan government officials.
And that's usual security measures?
No,
okay.
It's not.
Okay.
Usually you're in U.S. stuff, right?
Yeah.
So we're in these black sedans, and these things, they take off into the middle of the desert on a highway through the desert in the I don't know, 10:00 at night or something like that.
Yeah.
It's completely dark. We could have been going anywhere.
Right.
They're going 90 miles an hour or something. We drive for 45 minutes out into the middle of nowhere. Suddenly I see these stadium lights. I'm like, what the hell are the stadium lights? Get closer, and at this point it's 10:30, 11 p.m., something like that. And there's this gigantic stadium, and there's guys playing polo on these beautiful Arabian horses.
Wow.
In the middle of the night, lit up by stadium lights in the middle of nowhere. It was like the edge of a military base. That was weird. We sort of pull off to the side and go for like a mile or so down this like unpaved road with rocks and scrub and sand and all this stuff. And everybody said, "Oh, you're going to get to Gaddafi's tent, right? This is his thing." And everybody knew about Gaddafi's tent, right? He travels with his tent, all that. So I'm thinking like a tent, like I was just imagining some sort of Lawrence of Arabia sort of thing. We drive up. Lindsey Graham was sitting next to me. He goes, "Well, that looks like a Winnebago to me." And that was the tent. We go in there.
Gaddafi's Winnebago?
It wasn't a Winnebago. Technically, it was a tent. But it looked more like a Winnebago than Lawrence of Arabia, whatever.
Yeah.
So we go in there. We meet with Mutassim, who subsequently was killed, and a couple of the other his son is national security advisor, and some of these other people. And we sort of had some pleasantries and things like that. And then Gaddafi comes in, and he was wearing black jeans. He was wearing a black shirt, button-down shirt, and it had green maps of Africa all over it. And we had a note taker from the embassy who sort of nudged me and said, I was in a meeting like this with Gaddafi about a week ago. And he's wearing exactly the same thing. So, okay, fine. This was when the Pan Am flight 103 Lockerbie, people were about to be, or a guy was about to be released and come back to Libya. So we sort of talked about that. And then I don't know what got him onto this, but Gaddafi started talking about Bulgarian nurses that had infected Libyan children by pricking them with AIDS-infected needles.
There you go.
And he kind of went on and on and on about that. And there seemed to be very little coherence really to any of this sort of stuff. I mean, there were nuggets here and there.
But
and then once the Bulgarian stuff and the Pan Am Flight 103 stuff, I think it was probably McCain that kind of ended the meeting.
All right, we're good. Yeah.
But okay, been there, we met him.
Well, thanks for sharing that story. One more question I want to ask you, and maybe less sort of humorous, but I don't know. I will ask you. Tell me about the 2008 visit to the Western Wall with John McCain.
Oh, yeah. Well, that was...
in Jerusalem, yeah.
Right. So, in part, this showed how neophyte, well, certainly I was with anything related to a presidential campaign, but actually how kind of fly by the seat of your pants the McCain presidential campaign was, even after he nominally had the nomination. Because normally... And, my friends who were working on the Obama campaign, they had Secret Service protection. They traveled with like an array of aides. They had convoys. They had all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
We went to Israel, and I think it was Lindsey Graham, John McCain, Joe Lieberman, and me.
Mm-hmm.
And
three amigos.
And our communications director. And that was it. We didn't have any security, anything else. And the Israelis insisted on having 4 security guards basically around McCain. I think they knew what we were getting into more than we did. So anyway, one of the things we were going to do is go down the Western Wall. We had done this before. I had done this before with McCain. This was not a big deal. Well, it's a big deal when he might be the next president of the United States. This is what we had not appreciated. So there was this group of Israeli journalists that had been standing in the sun for like 2 or 3 hours waiting to get this picture of John McCain at the Western Wall. And so we go up there, and McCain goes up to the Western Wall. He's there with Lieberman. He's there with Lindsey Graham. I'm kind of hanging back a little bit behind this group of photographers and journalists and all this stuff. Everything's kind of going okay, but even then there's this like crush of this crowd trying to get the pictures. They're all starting to jostle with each other. Elbows are getting thrown. They're cranky because they've been out there in the sun for so long and stuff like that. Everything's still okay. This guy gets who has long beard, wearing this kind of robe. He gets on a chair, stands up, and just goes, "John McCain, the next president of the United States." And I don't know how this sets something off, but suddenly there's pushing, there's shoving, there's like punches being thrown, like all this other kind of stuff. They have the guys who collect the shekels there on the kotel.
Yeah.
And so somebody gets thrown into one of those, shekels goes all over the place, bouncing off the ground. I look for one of the security guys who had an Uzi. He gets pushed, and the clip of his Uzi drops out and clatters along that. And that's when I was like, I don't know that this is my scene, actually. And so somebody yells at me, Richard, do something. I'm like, what the hell am I supposed to do? I don't have an Uzi, or whatever, and all of this. And so this scuffle broke out at the Western Wall. I remember Senator Graham got hit in the knee with like a Sony Handycam and was limping for the next 2 days, and all this other kind of stuff. Yeah. So anyway, so this is what happened. But I mean, it was in a way kind of humorous. Everybody was fine. But it was also indicative of we were in a new world that we had not totally appreciated.
I want to spend a few minutes talking about that presidential election campaign, but one last question on these trips. Do you ever get left behind by a motorcade? Did that ever happen to you?
No, but almost when I was working at the NSC and I traveled to Europe with former Secretary of State James Baker. He was a special presidential envoy for Iraqi debt. Yeah. And we were in Berlin, and the convoy was just about to leave. And, I was in my 20s. I hadn't traveled that much. I was like, but I have to settle up my bill at the hotel.
Almost missed the most.
So nobody else is paying their bill at the hotel. They figured the cards are going to get charged, right? Yeah. So I'm there saying, can I have a receipt and duplicate all stuff? Yeah. And I'm looking out the window, and they're sort of like practically revving the engines. Yeah. And I look out, and the convoy starts moving, and I'm like, oh shit! So I ran after the convoy, and then they let me in. And I made it, but I probably would still be left in Berlin today.
So what was it like? Because you were on the campaign in 2008, and it was John McCain and Sarah Palin. I don't know if you ever briefed.
I did.
Yeah. What was it?
And I did bilats with her on the margins of the UN General Assembly in September of 2008. We did President Talabani of Iraq. We did Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, and we did Prime Minister Zardari of Pakistan.
Yeah.
And it was her and those three leaders individually, separate bilats, and that was something.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about that, because Sarah Palin was the former Alaska governor who was McCain's running mate. I like how George Packer, the Atlantic writer, describes her in his most recent book. She was sort of like the John the Baptist for Trumpism in terms of populist sentiment and things like this. Was she interested in the world when you were briefing her? Was she a quick study? Like, how was it really?
She didn't really know anything about foreign policy or the world.
Russia was in her backyard, though.
That is correct.
Yeah.
It was actually, well, I mean, to show you kind of how she got kind of plucked. Yes, she was the governor of Alaska and was a talented politician and telegenic and well-spoken, all this. But as everybody who is of a certain age will remember, Tina Fey impersoned her repeatedly on Saturday Night Live. The year before, Sarah Palin had dressed as Tina Fey for Halloween, because Tina Fey was the famous person, not Sarah Palin, right? So, I mean, this shows you, sort of plucked from this and thrown into, frankly, an environment that she was not prepared for, and that probably no one could bone up on all the differences and sort of things. But It was pretty difficult. She did not evince great knowledge of the world and of key foreign policy.
So, but from Sarah Palin to then having to staff Henry Kissinger at the convention, is that so right?
Yeah, exactly.
So I
sort of went back and exactly. So Kissinger and McCain had an interesting relationship that went all the way back to, of course, if you know this story, when McCain was in jail and in Hanoi, and Kissinger was doing the Paris peace talks with Lee Duc-Tho.
Yeah.
And as a sign of goodwill, they offered to release McCain as his dad was essentially the kind of PACOM commander back then and all of this. But that would have been against the rules and the protocol of the military, which says you have to be released in order that you're captured. So you can't jump the line even if they offer you release. And so Kissinger said, no, I'm not going to take him. And that meant that McCain had, more time in jail, right? Which is not exactly pleasant.
Yeah.
And the story that I heard was and actually strangely kind of heard it from both Kissinger and McCain separately, was there's this famous photograph of the POWs getting off the plane and Nixon greeting them, and McCain is literally dragging himself on crutches, and he's in his naval uniform. And Kissinger, I guess, was a little nervous. Okay, here's the guy who I sort of consigned a lot more time in a hellhole. And the first thing that McCain said to Kissinger when he met him there was, "Thank you, sir, for saving my honor." And since then, they always had this bond, even though their worldviews were quite different.
That's right. Right. Yeah.
They didn't agree on a lot of kind of big issues, but he really liked Kissinger, talked to Kissinger, and Kissinger was a big admirer of McCain. So Kissinger in 2008 was at the Republican National Convention, and he and I spent a lot of time together. We watched Sarah Palin's excellent speech from the McCain family skybox, all this. And, Kissinger went around on the floor of the convention. At one point, someone from the Texas delegation gave him a cowboy hat, which he immediately put on, and the Associated Press put out on the wires a picture of Henry Kissinger on the floor of a convention in an arena with a cowboy hat on.
Yeah.
And so, there's...
Well, thanks for taking this trip down memory lane on that first part of your career. And I'm confident, actually, you're going to continue to play a role as a leading voice and maybe, hopefully, someday back in policy as well. I want to say, you and I got to really know each other about 10 years ago. We were talking, we co-led a number of trips to several Middle East countries. And I think I've developed such a strong respect for you and a great friendship with you. I want to take you back to 2016. We were on a bipartisan delegation that you and I organized together. I was at the Center for American Progress, who's Center for New American Security. We were in one of these Middle East countries where we have an air base. And we spent part of our day going to an air base, and they were talking about the more investments they're making, about how the U.S. is deepening its military presence. That was the morning. And then in the afternoon, we go do a think tank event where you and I are sort of the keynote speakers, moderated left and right. It's an election year, but we're still sort of working together. And what did we hear from the moderator and from the audience?
You are leaving. You have left, or you're leaving the Middle East. You're abandoning the Middle East. You are departing. You're gone.
Why do you think they felt that way? I mean, again, because of the facts we heard that morning and saw with our own eyes,
right,
is that we were deepening our presence.
So I thought about this pretty systematically, because it wasn't just that trip. I mean, any American who traveled around the Middle East for a good decade would hear over and over and over again, America has left, or America is leaving, or America is just about to leave the Middle East. And they had different reasons why they thought that was the case. They thought, well, you really just want to focus at home, or you're tired of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, and so you want to get out of that, or you're pivoting to Asia, or whatever it is, right? And then sometimes that'd be coupled with, and Russia and China are moving in. Well, okay, that's interesting. And they point to Syria and what the Russians have done also. And so I wrote this book last year on the effort of the United States to sort of rebalance its foreign policy to Asia. So we actually looked at what we had in the Middle East. Well, we had this exact same number of air bases in the Middle East at the end of that decade that we had at the beginning.
Yeah.
We had effectively the same number of troops in the Middle East we had at the beginning. If you count up diplomacy, how many times the Secretary of State or the President go to the Middle East versus other places, that was about the same too.
Yeah.
So you look at the presence that we had in the Middle East, it was the same. We hadn't gone anywhere. You look at all the stuff we had, it hadn't gone anywhere. You look at all the trips that were taken there. You look at the engagement, that was all there. And what I think was happening was it wasn't about presence, although that was what the words suggested. It was about performance. It was about the perception of reliability and consistency in our policy, because the United States got out of Iraq in 2011 and then went back a couple of years later in greater numbers than we had at the end of Iraq to beat back ISIS, right? So we did leave, but we did come back, right?
Yeah.
If in the Trump administration, I mean, the Iranian attack on the oil fields at Abqaiq was sort of the textbook case of when the Saudis would have expected the U.S. to come to their defense.
Yeah.
And we didn't, right? The Houthis shooting missiles into Saudi Arabia or UAE.
Yeah.
Those are the kinds of things that I think the leadership in these countries evinced a genuine idea on the American side that we can somehow be done with the Middle East. We just never got around to being done,
right?
Because it's not realistic to be done.
Yeah.
but we did kind of want to be done with the Middle East.
Right. So the joke I make is the 2010s for U.S. policy in the Middle East is kind of like Brokeback Mountain, where the one cowboy says to the other, "I wish I knew how to quit you."
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. That's exactly it. And my view has been, if we had improved our performance and consistency, we probably could have and probably still could reduce our presence, but just act differently.
Right.
It's not about how much resources are on the ground, right? I mean, count up the number of resources we've had on the ground at any moment you want to pick and how much the Russians have. Why would you think the Americans are leaving or have left and the Russians have started? It doesn't even qualify. Same thing with the Chinese. But again, it's about performance and reliability and expectations and these obvious desires the United States had to, frankly, in a lot of political leadership, too, that never have to think about the Middle East again.
So there you have it, listeners. Richard Fontaine says it's not what you have, it's how you use it. And the vibes you give off.
That was a Katulis formulation for those who are keeping track at home.
But we've done a number of these trips, and part of the spirit, and I know we need to come to a close here, we sort of did it in an era where there was a massive polarization, but not as bad as where we are right now, and trying to build relationships, friendships, and relationships of trust that I still use to this day, and am enriched by. But where are we in the politics of this on U.S. national security? Sort of my last couple of questions here for you before we get to your origin story. Where do you see the GOP today? Because you were at the upper echelons as a staffer, but senior advisor to the presidential candidate in 2008. You served at the National Security Council. How would you describe the state of politics of national security in the GOP today?
GOP policy right now is Trump policy. People will say that's wrong and point to all the senators, for example, who are more traditionalist Republicans, international, whatever. What policies have they changed?
Are you surprised that people like Marco Rubio, now Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, have, from my perspective at least, shifted their views quite substantially? Are you surprised that happened?
I am surprised. Rubio has shifted. I'm surprised to some degree at that, but there's also at least arguably a case for that because he works for the president. I'm more surprised by how supine and quiescent the Republicans in Congress have been on things that they cared about pretty recently.
Yeah.
I mean, they passed a law saying that TikTok is banned, and the president says, well, I just don't want to do that. And they say, okay. Or they appropriate money for particular causes, and the president or his administration says, well, we don't want to spend that.
Yeah.
And they say, okay. Or they put tariffs on the entire world simultaneously, which I can tell you a lot of Republicans don't think is good economic policy and takes, stakes in private sector
companies. But they don't say anything about it.
And they say, okay. Or, these, not that anyone, you could really have expected lots of people to fall on their sword for USAID.
Yeah.
But, some of these very same people who, as recently as last year, had legislation increase the amount of foreign aid we would have in our soft power toolkit and gave impassioned speeches about foreign aid and development assistance, humanitarian assistance, how important this is, everything else. When this was all being eviscerated, they said, that was what he said.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's politics. That's not policy, but the policy is.
Do you think that can shift?
Policy. It definitely can. I mean, I think, elected Republicans have seen what has happened to elected Republicans that let too much daylight open up between them and Donald Trump. I mean, what are, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger and Jeff Flake and Mitt Romney and all these other folks doing right now in the Congress? Nothing, because they're not there.
Yeah.
And the ones who survive, are careful about what they cross the president on. But, I mean, this is the first year of a 4-year term, a lame duck term, and all of that. And so I think the political gravity will shift over time.
Where do you see the Democrats on foreign policy today?
I don't think they have a center of gravity.
Yeah.
I don't think they have a message or a messenger. Now, that's not terribly surprising because they just lost a presidential election and just finished a 4-year term. So most of Democratic foreign policy positions now seem to be last administration approach good and this administration all bad. But that doesn't get you very far.
Yeah.
And the thing that I'm curious about, which I have not yet heard, but again, it's early days into, a new political era, is there's not going to be a restoration of the status quo ante in all of our foreign policy institutions and all our foreign policy approaches. We saw that when Trump was here the first time around, whether it was with trade and, a bunch of other things. But a lot of Democrats, I think, for very obvious reasons, don't believe that continuing the kind of Trump approach is the right thing. So it's really about renewal, right? It's about renewing America's role in the world. It's about renewing our own foreign policy tools and institutions and approaches. What does that mean?
Yeah.
What's the vision?
No, and I don't think...
I could tell you my vision. You could probably tell me your vision. But what about the Democrats who want to be the next president of the United States?
Yeah.
I haven't seen anybody formulate a vision yet.
Yeah, and I think their center of gravity is still on domestic issues and fighting the fights on the Constitution and rule of law here at home and economic issues and things like this. But I think if it's just that, it's going to be incomplete. I actually think when I get outside of the bubble and I give about 2-3 times a month, I'm lucky enough to give talks around the country in places like Peoria. In October, I've been to Dallas and Louisville and other places. And I think there's a general pragmatic internationalism that I see from businessmen, from farmers and others who know that America's economy and its security and cyber and other things are connected with the rest of the world. So we need a steadier approach. But I think bland slogans like foreign policy for a middle class, like we heard from the Biden team, really don't animate the spirit of many Americans. It sounds technocratic and kind of like pointy-head guys at think tanks going around listening to folks.
Hey, now you're cutting a little close to the bone.
But it doesn't feel authentic to a lot of Americans. Yeah. But there is, I think, something authentic that is internationalist with many ordinary Americans. We're not isolationist, I don't think, in any core, although there's a strand in our politics that's out there. I think today, there's just a pragmatic recognition. There's an internationalism that is necessary to keep America strong, but we don't have yet the articulation of what that looks like, either from the left or the right.
I think that's true, except I do think that there's a broad, relatively kind of unfocused discontent with globalization.
Yeah.
And the endless wars. I mean, if you say, what were the defining features of U.S. foreign policy over the past 30 years, and you ask somebody who sort of looks at this stuff casually, they would probably say something along the lines of globalization with trade and sort of all the economic changes that have happened over 30 years, plus the wars we've gotten ourselves into.
Yeah.
And there's a decent percentage of the population that concludes both of those didn't work for them. I don't know that that's the right appreciation on the economic side for sure. I mean, I think that's a much more complicated story than is often felt.
Right.
But nevertheless, I mean, Trump, in his way, gives voice to that, right? It's been an era where there's been lots of immigration, where there's been, sort of hyper-globalization of finance and trade and shifts of manufacturing. There's been wars that have fought for 20 years at great price and blood and treasure without a whole lot to show for it. There's been other things, the Arab Spring and other stuff that looks so promising, and the United States got, pretty involved in that. And what do we have to show for that, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a narrative there that, again, I think the reality is more complicated than that in a lot of ways. But you can understand why somebody might be generally internationalist, generally for free trade, generally for these things, but say, whatever these experts have done for the past 30 years, let's give the non-experts a try if it just is going to be more of that.
Yeah, no, there you go. Well, good. We covered a lot of ground. Let me ask you 2 final questions. And I ask every person who comes on this podcast, and the focus of this is for the next generation mostly. How'd you get into this? What's your origin story in this field? What was the spark?
I was born in New Orleans and was raised outside New Orleans. They didn't really have foreign policy where I came from. And honestly, don't think I really knew that foreign policy was a thing for a long time. But I always liked international stuff. I'm old enough that when I was a really little kid, they used to have these things called pen pals. They would write these things called letters on stuff called paper.
Where was yours? I had one in Ukraine.
I had one in Uganda.
Uganda?
I had one in... This shows how old I am. I had one in Yugoslavia. You remember that place?
Oh, yeah.
So, and so I was just fascinated for whatever reason with international life and what people in other cultures and other countries that spoke different languages and saw the world differently and all of this. So I had pen pals and, all this other kind of stuff. And so I always liked international stuff. I was always interested in politics.
Yeah.
And then when I got to college, they said, oh, there's this field called international relations. So I said, well, that sounds...
Where'd you go to college?
To Tulane.
Uh-huh.
So I went to Tulane. I spent a year at Oxford. And then I realized, okay, this is the stuff I really like. I like this international relations stuff.
Cool.
but I still didn't know what that meant other than joining the Foreign Service. Like
Yeah.
that, but by that point, I knew you could become a diplomat.
Yeah.
I didn't know what else there was, in the ecosystem. This is not, it's pretty, especially then, it was pretty opaque for somebody who'd never really encountered this stuff. Anyway, so after college, I went off and lived in Japan for a year. And then the one thing that I figured out by that point was whatever the thing was that I would do, that you get to do some foreign policy stuff, it was in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
I had figured that out.
So you moved here.
So I moved to Washington, D.C. and figured, okay, well, I'll find a job. And I just started looking around, dropping off resumes, all this other kind of stuff. And my first real job was doing Middle East and South Asia on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
Oh, cool.
I remember my first interview, they said, you lived in Japan, you traveled over Asia, you wrote a thesis on China, Taiwan. You don't seem to know much about the Middle East. I said, it's interesting, but I really don't. And they were like, just the person we're looking for.
Oh, my God.
It tells you something about U.S. government, actually.
Yeah.
But of course, it was completely fascinating and all of this. And then I went off to grad school. And after that, did something that is not, I don't think exists at this point now, the Presidential Management Fellows program.
Fine. Yeah.
Went to the State Department, and, moved around, worked for Rich Armitage when he was Deputy Secretary, went over to the NSC.
Right.
In first Asia Directorate, then the Middle East Directorate.
Yeah.
And one day I got this call, John McCain is looking for a foreign policy guy. Are you interested? And I did that and ended up going to do that. Had no idea he was going to run for president. Had never worked on a campaign in my entire life. Yeah. Not for mayor or anything else. And, one thing leads to the next, to the next, to the next.
Yeah. So it's that original pen pal relationship in Uganda.
Exactly.
And things like this. The other thing before I ask my last question that I really appreciate about you is some of the things that you've written that are non-think tank related, and with your brother Mike.
Oh yeah.
Tell us a little bit about Mike. He's a Latinist, right? He's a classics professor. And
that's right. So my younger brother, he's 2 years younger than me, and he is a professor of classics at Cornell University, where he focuses on mostly Latin works, but he's done Greek and a bunch of other things. He does a lot of translation, a lot of teaching, things like that.
Yeah. And you've done some trips and some writing with him.
Exactly. So we in something of a bit of a sibling rivalry, it turned out he was the first Fontaine to have an article in the print edition of Foreign Affairs.
Whoa, not you.
Which is really encroaching on my territory.
Yeah.
I mean, that would be like me having be the first Fontaine with an article in the Bryn Mawr Classical Review, which I was not and have never had. But he was asked to do a long review of Mary Beard's history of the Roman Republic.
Yeah.
The Roman Republic.
Yeah.
And so he did that. And this got like all this attention. Also, screw you too, brother.
Yeah.
So anyway, but no, we love each other. And so after that, we started saying, we should write something together, blah, blah, blah. We can never really quite figure out what this was. There was a new translation of the Oedipus plays that came out. And so Mike and I did a joint review. And actually, I think it was for the Bryn Mawr Classical Review, now that I think about it.
You're in it.
But the average classics journal has a circulation of like 5, something like that. So you don't quite feel it when you publish something. But we did that, and that was fun. And then I am armchair interested in classics and Roman ruins and all stuff like so many people.
Same.
He's a real expert.
Yeah.
So we've traveled together. We went to Algeria together. We've gone to Turkey together. We've gone to a bunch of different places as brothers, just brothers trips to see some of these great sites and all of this. And when we got back from Algeria in particular, we decided to do basically a combination written and photo essay for a classical
I saw that
site. And very few people actually end up going to Algeria, and the ones who do tend not to go to the sites we were. There's literally nobody there, but it was
amazing,
completely amazing. Mike,
where can they find that? Where is it online? Do you know?
It was.
I was just looking at it earlier today.
They
just Google your name in Algeria,
Richard Fontaine and Michael Fontaine or Mike Fontaine, and if they look for our Algeria essay, then they'll see, if nothing else, a lot of kind of cool pictures of the
it's really awesome. So very last question, what would you advise the next generation that wants to follow in your footsteps? It's 2025. They want to have a career like you have. What would you say is the one thing they should do, the skill or?
Well, I think one thing is to jump in with both feet and try to do it. I mean, this is probably how you feel too, but I think it's a meaningful and fulfilling career to try to influence the policy of our country in what we believe to be a positive direction.
Yeah.
In the world at a time when there's a whole lot of things up in the air.
Right.
I mean, it's important work. You're not always going to be successful, but the effort is worth the trying. And so I think, it might be easy to look at all of our divisions, the government shutdown, and oh, can you make a difference? And if you work in government or this or that, but you can make a difference, and you should try to make a difference. And I think these things are intrinsically absolutely fascinating issues, but it's also important to people. So that one is jump in, and the other is, look for. Don't have I don't know. My advice, I guess, would be don't think you need to have a plan. Where I used to get when I was young and ask people for advice. They say, okay, figure out where you want to be in 10 years, and then figure out the steps necessary to get you there.
Yeah.
Which for a while I was like, I don't know where I want to be in 10 years, and I don't know what those steps are.
Yeah.
But what I did instead was try to look for opportunities, including where opportunities were not obvious, to work in places, to work for people, to get to know people, to work on particular issues, and just try to have discrete, meaningful, fulfilling experiences and have one after the other. And as you know, when you get older, you get more senior in what you're doing just by getting older, right? So you can be kind of flexible and haphazard. You just have to have the eagerness and the willingness to learn and to do it.
But get out there, make connections with people, go out and see the world. Well, Richard, thanks for being such a great friend. Thanks for coming on the episode.
Thank you for the mug.
Yeah, you got the mug, the Katulis, taking the edge off Middle East.
Coveted silhouette or something. I don't know what you guys. His silkscreen version of Brian.
Yeah, there we go. But appreciate you coming on. Everybody should read his report, Swing States, especially with, it seems, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, coming to town. He talks about Saudi Arabia and other countries in it. Wrote it with his colleague Gibbs. But really appreciate you coming on and being such a good friend.
Let me just say one last thing, and I don't want to just turn into a mutual admiration society, but so we got to know each other about 10 years ago, as you said, and you were at the Center for American Progress and all of this. And one of the things that I appreciated about just your thinking from the very beginning was, one, it is not hidebound. It is not conventional. It is not party line, whatever party that might be. It's not predictable. It's thoughtful. Yeah. It draws on multiple sources. I was about to use the F word. It's freaking fearless,
thank
too,
you.
right?
Thank you. Yeah.
Which is no easy task in this line of work, because a lot of people are thinking about, well, I want to make sure I don't offend this person, or what if that person disagrees, or, well, I'm lining myself up for that job I'm going to have in 28 years, and, this other stuff, instead of saying, like, look, I'm going to look at whatever the set of issues is, whatever the set of international relations is, whatever the set of policymakers, Republican, Democrat, vegetarian, whatever, in Washington, and I'm just going to call them like I'm CEO. And I'll be open to being persuaded otherwise if people want to have that conversation. I just find that enormously rare, and you've kept it up all this time, and I think it shows in this podcast and the other work you do. So thank you for doing
that. I mean, the inspiration for that is Whitesnake and their song "Here I Go Again on My Own."
Wait, so now I'm picturing you writhing on the hood of a car.
Sorry, we really need to cut this short now. Yeah,
it's time to go.
All right, folks, that's all the time we have for this week. Sorry. Again, thank you to our listeners for tuning in to our colleagues for their work on this week's episode. You can follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events. I'm Brian Katulis. We will see you all soon.